EA's done it again. Friends, I cannot believe that in my lifetime I have seen the Dead Space franchise die twice. Now, there's actually a surprising amount to this story, that EA has apparently canned the Dead Space series and that Motive is no longer working on it. We've had a few different sources, a few different corroborations, and EA themselves have even come out to say that no, they have not cancelled Dead Space 2, and while that's technically true, they have apparently put the Dead Space IP on ice. Now, where did all this begin? Well, the other day, Jeff Grubb, who is usually extremely reliable when it comes to insider information and leaks, tweeted out that Motive was apparently working on a Dead Space 2 remake that had been canned by EA. This then, for whatever reason, managed to snowball to the point where EA themselves had to come out and say that they don't officially confirm or deny rumors, but that this isn't true. Dead Space 2's remake was never in production, so they couldn't cancel it. Then we got another confirmation from Jason Schreier's Bloomberg, who wrote an article hopefully clearing up exactly what had happened. He clarified from his sources that Dead Space 2 was never in official production. Therefore, it couldn't necessarily officially be cancelled. As he explains it, after the Motive team released Dead Space 1 last year, they got to work brainstorming what they could do next, and their hope apparently was a new installment in the Dead Space franchise. They were hoping to accomplish that rather than just make another remake. However, Jason Schreier explains that these ideas were just ideas. They were never greenlit, nothing was ever officially put into production, whether that be a remake or a continuation of the franchise. But he does confirm in the report that, yeah, the franchise is on ice once again. EA at this moment in time doesn't have any interest in Motive making a game set in this universe, and as they themselves confirmed last year, they are hard at work on EA's Iron Man game, and of course, a new Battlefield installment. We'll get to that later on. And honestly, while it was important to confirm exactly what EA had done in this situation, that they hadn't cancelled a game that was like 6, 9, or 12 months into production, it still sucks to see them admit that the Dead Space remake was apparently lackluster when it came to sales, and they have no interest in pursuing more games set in that franchise. I absolutely adored the remake that came out last year. I thought Motive's work was exceptional across the board. They managed to breathe fresh life into a franchise that was so associated with Visceral Games, who of course made the first 3 titles in the series and then were tragically canned by EA and shut down. It wasn't quite on the level of Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 4, but it did make some interesting changes, like giving Isaac Clarke, the protagonist, a voice this time around, and actually making the game's structure a little bit more of a Metroidvania, allowing you to explore the ship much more freely and hiding secrets and jump scares around every corner. It meant that if you had played the original to death, there was something new for you to experience, and if you were experiencing it for the first time, you were getting the most feature-rich version of the game. It wasn't perfect, of course, but it definitely felt like an announcement that Dead Space was back, and it was warmly received by critics and fans alike. However, it apparently didn't sell well. According to reports, it only sold about 2 million copies, which, if you can recall way back when Dead Space 3 came out, the number back then was 5 million copies for the franchise to continue. Now, we don't really know what the number would have been this time around because Dead Space 3 was a sequel, this is a remake, and, you know, just the general economic conditions of the industry have changed. But if that was the number back then, 2 million, you can see why they probably haven't continued it, or they weren't eager to throw more money into this franchise. But the question is it EA's fault the game didn't sell? Is it because people don't like the franchise, or what factors went into this? Obviously, I'm no financial expert, but I do think that given Dead Space a $70 price point was a bit of a killer, especially when it comes to remakes. We've seen that price point just kill certain projects kind of dead, or at least sour people on wanting to go out and buy it day one. I mean, look at The Last of Us remake. Yes, it's not as old as Dead Space, and we have had a remaster where Dead Space hadn't, but that was another game that, taken on its own merits, was excellent. I did the review for that title, and I genuinely think the work Naughty Dog put into it was amazing. That's now the definitive version of that game. For me, I think that everyone should play it, but again, as I said in that review, should you play it for full price? Is it worth that price point? I can see to many why it wouldn't be. You've already got a version of the game that still looks beautiful today that's being remastered, available on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. It's a game that at the time of its remake was only 10 years old and had multiple different versions. Of course, Dead Space isn't a one-to-one comparison. That game came out in 2008, and unlike The Last of Us, like I said, didn't have an official remaster, even if the games were available on Xbox backwards compatibility. You could say that it was more ripe for a remake, but even then, when it comes to what was added to that remake, or the perceived value of the remake, to a lot of people, and rightly so, it was just a prettier, better playing version of what they played back in 2008. Yeah, Isaac Clarke now has a voice. Yeah, there are a few more areas, but it's not, like I said, as substantial of an overhaul as Resident Evil 2, which arguably justified its larger price point, but even then wasn't sold for $70. I think, honestly, EA was asking a lot with the $70 price point. This was the first time the franchise has had an outing since 2013, and it was a remake of a game that was kind of, admittedly, niche to begin with. Like, Dead Space, as much as I love it, was never a Call of Duty, even though EA really wanted it to be. Like, what were the expectations for this game going in? I would love to have known. So you've got the fact of the price point, the fact that it's a remake, and just the fact that Dead Space isn't an IP on the level of a Battlefield, which was all kind of working against it. And even then, 2 million copies is nothing to sniff at. And the work that Motive did was exceptional. I would have loved to have seen their take on a brand new entry in this franchise. I would have loved to have seen what they would have done with this world. Would we have got Isaac Clarke back? Would they have followed up Dead Space 3 or done something entirely new, entirely unique, entirely associated with that studio rather than what Visceral Games had accomplished? And honestly, I still would have taken a Dead Space 2 remake. That's my personal favorite entry in the entire franchise. I think it gets the blend of action and horror just right. It still plays really well to this day. And if the developers took the template of the Dead Space 1 remake and applied it to 2, yeah, I'd prefer an original game, but I'd have still lapped that up. I think what really stings about the news, though, and again, we did know this as it was confirmed by Motive themselves the other year, is that the team, or at least part of the team, is working on a new Battlefield. Now, I'm the biggest Battlefield fan in this office, at least. I, of course, don't claim to speak for everyone in the community. I mean, I kind of like the operators in Battlefield 2042, but I'm a huge fan of that franchise. It's my favorite multiplayer series. It's my favorite first-person shooter series. I really hope the next installment is a return to form, and that everyone having all hands on deck makes it an exceptional back-to-basics experience. That said, even as a huge fan, I can concede that previous Battlefield games have pretty much killed off other studios or other titles entirely. I mean, look at Visceral Games. The people who made Dead Space to begin with, their last title before they went under was Battlefield Hardline, something they were drafted in to produce while DICE was making the next big sequel, and that underperformed, and after a string of Dead Space underperformances in EA's eyes, they were canned, they were shut down. And the same thing happened with Star Wars Battlefront 2 as well. Yes, that game had its problems at launch, and it was one of the most controversial titles pretty much ever when it first released, but by the end of its lifespan, that game was in a great place. The developers had done such a good job at supporting it with post-launch content, adding patches, making the game the version we all wanted it to be at launch, and the community responded. The community kind of forgave DICE and EA for that. It felt like the sequel was really about to hit its stride. All of the tie-ins to the other Star Wars properties at the time were well received and made for a bedrock of great DLC, and it felt like support was stopped just as things were about to get really good. We never got any proper Mandalorian integration, for instance. We never got the chance to see an Andor tie-in, or an Obi-Wan tie-in, or a Bad Batch tie-in, or anything like that. Just as the franchise was opening up on Disney+, Battlefront 2 was canned, and again, it was because the developers were put on the next Battlefield project, which turned out to be Battlefield 2042, which everyone didn't like, and we repeated the cycle again. Where that launched, people were like, oh, I don't think I enjoy the direction this franchise is going in, so then DICE had to spend the next few years completely turning the ship around, you know, dropping new patches, completely overhauling maps that they had initially released. And that's not to say Motive won't do a good job on the next Battlefield, or even that they're entirely arsed about losing Dead Space. Who knows what they wanted to do? Maybe they're really passionate about Battlefield. Maybe they're really passionate about Iron Man. I'm sure you have to be to work on those games. I think the issue for me is I just don't want EA to adopt the Activision model. And what I mean by that is taking these great studios who could have their own franchises or at least work on other people's franchises and roll them all in to the one big IP that you want to succeed. We've seen that over at Activision with the likes of High Moon Studios. We've seen it with Beanox. We've seen it with Vicarious Visions, who were then folded into Blizzard to work on Diablo and World of Warcraft and what have you. We've seen all of these personality-filled studios be rolled into the big franchise machine. And I just think that's a shame. I think it's a real shame. And that's ultimately my big takeaway from this. I, of course, think it's a shame that we're not going to get more Dead Space at least anytime soon while Motive works on these two projects. But my ultimate worry is that this is going to continue to be the norm across the entire industry. That developers, unique developers that work for these publishers and answer to these publishers are going to become part of the franchise machine and work on games maybe they're not all that passionate about. And hopefully that's not a crazy take, but I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. What do you think about EA snuffing out a new Dead Space or a Dead Space 2 remake before it officially had the chance to go into production? And what do you think about the idea of Motive et al. Working on a big franchise like Battlefield and not being able to produce their own headlining games? While you're down there, if you could as well, please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to whatculture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. I've been Josh. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.